No finner, no finner.
Hello. What I'm about to tell you is not a conspiracy. There's an angry, vocal group of people who shame those daring enough to speak out against them. These people are everywhere.
When they didn't date us because of feminism, we didn't wake up. They ruined Ghostbusters, and we didn't wake up then either. And when they were being shrill bitches 24/7, we didn't wake up.
Men have had a very rough go of it for just recently, and it ends now.
We can no longer speak freely.
Praise be, that was a beautiful film.
Blessed be the strong female protagonist.
So, most of you will have heard of men's rights activists. You may have seen their websites, blogs, you may have seen them on Twitter, those who haven't been banned from Twitter, that is.
There's a resistance. Do you know about 4chan and Reddit.com?
I took you for a dickless.
My username is Lena Dunham Hater 69. You
may have even seen some of them on TV or bought their books.
Quickest way to say it is I'm a grassroots activist.
No, he is a men's rights activist.
Men's rights activist. You're not one of those guys that like holds weird rallies about discrimination against men, are you?
I have, but only when the weather was nice.
So let me start by saying that men in Britain have problems. Boys underperform in education. 60,000 fewer men go to university each year than women. Our prison populations are overwhelmingly male.
Men's life expectancy is worse than women's, and it's not getting any better. You know, for instance, my granddad, in 2007, he was expected to live for 20 years. Now he's only expected to live for 10.
And suicide is, of course, the biggest killer of men, middle-aged men, in the UK. These are problems we need to address. But the problem is that men's rights don't address these issues.
He fights the equal pay of men's and women's.
Bruce, you fight against equal pay for men and women.
I fight for the right to be paid more if you're a man.
Its activism has the reach and the influence to help engineer actual change, but instead it exploits these issues for one aim: to fuel anti-women rhetoric.
Women make up 50% of the population of the world and spend 100% of their time bullying men on social media about bogus feminazi issues.
Both men and women suffer domestic violence.
I mean, we need to be able to talk about women's bodies without fear of being called a creep or sexist.
Or spiteful virgin. I hate that one.
But has the men's rights movement set up shelters for men? Have they called for government inquiries? Do they raise money for research to show the scope of violence against men? No, instead they spend their time trolling women.
And now, here are the cell phone numbers of the women who did not accept my invite to the Save Bill Cosby Facebook group.
In choosing to spew misogyny and hate rather than effect actual change, these keyboard crusaders are betraying the very people they claim to help: men.
Before the war, I was a senior VP. Now I'm a senior VP with some female colleagues.
No, hey! All I said was she looks like she can take a dick! It's a compliment!
Historically, men's rights activism has always attacked women's rights.
In the last century, women won the right to vote and the right to hold office. Men didn't win either of those things.
And I don't normally quote Urban Dictionary, but I feel like they hit the nail on the head with its description of Meninism as a movement that claims to advocate men's rights, but fails to do so because they're too busy complaining about and harassing feminists.
Bruce, you shut down 2 Planned Parenthoods?
My group did, yeah.
Every time I cover International Women's Day, it leads to men's rights activists asking why the same attention isn't given to International Men's Day.
Behind every successful woman is a man she has oppressed.
It's similar to the All Lives Matter response to Black Lives Matter. It misses the point entirely.
Yeah, Bruce, let me guess. When you were 18, a girl broke your heart, and that's how you got into your male activism?
That is an accurate description, yes.
My final point is that while it's easy to laugh off men's rights,
men used to be respected. I mean, we can still get wasted and eat tacos, but call feminism an ugly girl thing, and it's jail for you.
Stop manspreading.
Their anger towards women they promote is really dangerous.
How could you post my home address on 4chan?
If you wouldn't have testified that I was a sex offender, I wouldn't have my address online. I thought you feminists wanted everything equal.
In 2014, a 22-year-old man called Elliott Rodgers went on a shooting spree in California. He frequently visited men's rights website, and just before the shooting, he posted a video on YouTube, which said, "I don't know why you girls aren't attracted to me, but I will punish you all for it." There were obviously many, many reasons behind this horrendous incident.
These chicks just don't understand that there wouldn't be so many women's rights issues if they would just stop complaining about them.
But undeniably, one of them was his hatred of women, no doubt fueled by the men's rights websites that he visited.
Okay, but I'm not physically attracted to you, okay? Like, I miss the macho guys, you know, and sex with you is no good.
Yes, I understand.
You can't leave me, you know?
I cannot.
You know, I don't like your body.
Yes.
I don't like your face.
I understand.
So, I think that maybe you should go, okay? Okay, bye-bye.
He felt entitled, as a man, to a woman, which combined with his isolation, sparked anger. Not all men's rights activists are murderers, of course, but some are, and that's enough.
People always talk about how women are stereotyped in the media, but if you look closely, men are as well. For instance, men are shown to be violent and abusive in TV programs like the news.
The other danger of men's rights is how its activists minimize atrocities inflicted upon women.
Oh, so I guess he was asking for it because of the way he was dressed?
They perpetuate damaging myths, one of the most common being that women lie about sexual assault and therefore innocent men are wrongly accused of rape.
We just want you to see women as people.
I just want to be allowed to say whatever I want about women's tits.
It's essential to talk about and address the issues that women face and men face, which could save lives. But we need to find a way to do it that isn't at the expense of women.
That's right. If you want to bake a pie, that's great. If you want to have a career, that's great too. Do both or neither, it doesn't matter. Just don't judge what someone else has decided to do. I mean, we're all just trying to find the right path for us as individuals on this earth. Second, the mailman, where are you? You're ridiculous, and men's rights is nothing.
And in its peddling of hatred towards women and its absence of solutions to the problems that men face, its activism lets everybody down, including men.
I think that women should get out the money and run the house.
That's what I think too, 100%.
No, I don't think it is, Bruce.
Huh? What is he saying?
Well, Marisol, he's saying some things that we don't all agree with.
It's fair to say that as far as pastimes go, taking time out of your day to proactively champion the rights of boys and men isn't an especially fashionable or popular one. In recent years, it has become increasingly accepted that work very much needs to be done to address areas of inequality, predominantly or disproportionately impacting on boys and men. And yet a major problem or chill factor faced by anyone seeking to do exactly that are the sort of perceptions that exist about the sort of people who proactively champion equality and human rights for men. Perceptions that can be significantly influenced by perspectives pushed into mainstream media narratives, most particularly unflattering portrayals of so-called men's rights activists. Portrayals that can range from sad, eccentric, misplaced, misinformed and isolated individuals to dangerous and abusive women-hating collectives who offer a gateway to extremist ideologies and to the much feared far right. The purpose of this episode is to consider how accurate some of the pejorative language and negative connotations associated with men's rights really is. Most particularly, pejorative language and negative insinuations regarding the personal motivations, beliefs, goals and behaviour of people popularly perceived to proactively, even passionately promote and seek to combat the perhaps counterintuitive concept of gendered inequalities impacting on men. And to do this most effectively, I invite you to consider a number of definitions that will hopefully help us to establish a consensus concerning what men's rights activism really means. Unlike feminism or feminists, you will currently struggle to find a definition for men's rights activism or activist in most popular dictionaries. Nevertheless, many people tend to understand men's rights activism to be, at least to some extent, a mirror image of feminism. So let's begin with that. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines feminism in two ways as follows. It is both the theory of the political, economic and social equality of the sexes and organised activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. The second of these meanings most immediately aligns with the concept of men's rights activism. So let's consider this first, because just as a feminist or women's rights activist is generally understood to participate in activism or advocacy on behalf of women's interests, a men's rights activist is understood to participate in activism or advocacy on behalf of the rights and interests of men. It logically follows that people advocating for equality and human rights for men or women could be perceived as working towards two sides of a common or shared goal. And while to some extent this can be true, more often than not, especially in mainstream narratives, men's rights activists, or MRAs, and women's rights activists, or feminists, are viewed as two very separate movements, sometimes operating in opposition to each other, who advocate on behalf of and seek legal protections and civil and economic gains exclusively for one sex only, sometimes even at the expense of the other.
It's an equality club for both genders. It's about men coming in support of women and women coming in support of men.
Men like to talk a good game, but they don't realise that equality isn't just about pushing someone forward, it's also about pushing some people back.
Like when we create a space, our own space, to talk about our own issues and the things that we have to deal with, whether it be harassment or objectification or, you know, income inequality, whatever the case may be, you know, these MRAs decide to like go trample on our parade and say, but what about the men's? I'm sorry, you have been taking over our politics and our media for God knows when, you know, so don't even start with that whole, oh, but you don't think about the men's issue. Well, then, you know what? Start your own goddamn movement, which they have.
I'm reading fucking Facebook. It's not just for you, Mr. Entitled.
Significantly, many of the criticisms directed and stereotypes projected onto MRAs are essentially a mirror image, or at least very similar to those often associated with feminists. Where feminists are accused of hating men, MRAs are accused of misogyny. Both have been portrayed unfavourably as unhappy, unattractive, angry, narcissistic, friendless, or unsuccessful in life or love. Common stereotypical tropes about feminists include fat, hairy, and lesbian, while MRAs are often presumed to have a tiny penis and live in their mother's basements. MRAs are portrayed as weak and lacking classical masculine traits, just as feminists are sometimes perceived to be unfeminine. MRAs have been accused of perpetuating myths or exaggerating the prevalence of such things as false rape allegations or paternity fraud, while feminists are frequently accused of cherry-picking statistics or promoting victimology and dubious social science theories like toxic masculinity. Some say feminism wants to destroy the family unit. Others say MRAs want to drag us back to the 1950s. Online, MRAs are accused of abusive behaviour and coordinated harassment, while feminists are criticised for creating Twitter mobs and conflating criticism with abuse. And significantly, both have at times been accused of supremacist behaviour, pushing authoritarian or extremist positions, and actually actively advocating against equal opportunities and equal rights for all. As with most stereotypes, there will of course be some truth to be found amongst so many such negative portrayals, especially at an individual level. Perhaps most obviously, many activists will have been inspired to take action following a personal experience of sex discrimination or an abusive relationship, or negative outcomes in a family or criminal court. But then again, many simply become involved because instinctually they feel that it's the right thing to do. And of course, activism can be monetized, and so for some, first and foremost, it can mean a full-time career. One example of this would be feminist campaigner, writer and broadcaster Caroline Criado Perez, who's one of the most high-profile feminists currently working in the United Kingdom, and regularly appears as an expert witness in legacy news media discussions about gender equality.
Do you think it is possible
possible even that the writer is correct to say the reason there are fewer women programmers is because they aren't as much into programming?
There is absolutely no evidence to suggest that this is a result of biological differences. The idea that, having a uterus makes me less predisposed to programming as opposed to the way in which we bring up boys and girls, for which there is a lot of evidence.
Famous feminists like Caroline Credo-Perez also offer a useful benchmark to consider when addressing one of the most common criticisms or pejorative perspectives pushed onto men's rights activists.
Both men and women suffer domestic violence. But has the men's rights movement set up shelters for men? No, instead they spend their time trolling women.
To some extent, this might be considered to be a fairly factual statement, but it's also very far from being fair, especially when you consider the purpose and definition of men's rights activism, and compare it to the activism that many advocates of women's rights prioritise themselves. For example, Caroline Credo-Perez is most famous for convincing the Bank of England to put a female historical figure on their banknotes and securing the first statue of a woman in Parliament Square. And yet, she is not a banker or a builder, and she does not sculpt statues. Instead, her activity, her activism on behalf of women's rights and interests, includes savvy social media campaigning and lobbying others who have the power to create the type of change or interventions that she wants to see but could never hope to achieve on her own. And anyone familiar with the history and indeed present-day function and funding model of the domestic violence charity Refuge will know that it is not necessarily accurate to claim that feminists build shelters either, and they certainly don't exclusively pay for the exclusive services that they provide, because local authorities are responsible for commissioning emergency refuge accommodation and have a statutory duty to provide accommodation for victims of domestic abuse facing homelessness. Central government also provides some core funding and recently committed £100 million between 2018 and 2020 to specifically combat violence against women and girls. Feminist lobby groups wield incredible influence in this area and on the direction and focus of a wide range of state-funded public provision policy positions. And as they focused almost exclusively on women's rights and interests, it logically follows that the relative absence of gender equality lobbyists speaking for boys and men can be seen to be one of the more obvious reasons why, out of the approximate 800 beds available in emergency refuge accommodation in the Greater London area, none are currently available to men. In such context, logically and strategically, it makes sense that activism aimed at lobbying local and central government might, in the long term, be more effective than attempting to build an entirely different and parallel, privately funded public service infrastructure entirely from the ground up. Especially in the context that it has been illegal for public and private service providers to directly discriminate against men or women since the 1970s, and the public authorities who spend public money providing services to the public have additional legal duties to show that they are advancing equality and eliminating discrimination in everything they do.
It happens to men too, you know.
It happens to men.
Do you want a point? It happens to men as well. Oh, yeah, okay.
He fights the equal pace of men's and women's.
The suggestions that men's rights activists advocate against equal pay for equal work or against women's health clinics are clearly ridiculous and clearly done for comic effect in Lena Dunham's comedy skit. But the intention is to exaggerate an oft-repeated suggestion about men's rights activists that is a lot more difficult to shake off.
Historically, men's rights activism has always attacked women's rights.
In the main, because it is often confused or conflated with one common criticism or observation about men's rights activists that often happens to be true. The principal reason for this can be understood by considering the primary definition of feminism, namely that it is the theory of the political, economic and social equality of the sexes. Some feminists suggest that this theory can be condensed to simply mean a belief in equality between men and women, and therefore it logically follows that if you believe that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities, then you are by definition a feminist.
If you think our politicians exist beyond their legs.
If you believe in equality, no matter your race, gender or sexuality.
If you believe you should be brought up as an individual and not as a stereotype.
If you think you should be judged on your talents and nothing else.
If you believe in the freedom of identity and expression.
If you believe in ending sexual violence.
If you believe in changing the world through activism.
If you believe that all genders should be able to do what they like without hassle.
Then you're probably a feminist.
However, many people observe a disconnect or inconsistency between this assertion and the behaviour or beliefs of many individuals who personally choose to self-identify as feminist.
Men think it's a women's word, that it's only women, it's only for women. But it really just means that you believe in equality, and if you stand for equality, then you're a feminist. Sorry to tell you.
How can you behave like that to somebody? You're inciting, but it doesn't matter. You do not shout.
I don't need to hear from other white men.
And more so, in reality, most people understand that this theory, this definition of feminism, acknowledges the fact that it is a political ideology. And like all political ideologies, it is a certain set of ethical ideals, principles, doctrines and myths about how society does and should work, and which also offers some sort of political and cultural blueprint for a certain type of social order.
I think it's very obvious from this conversation that feminism isn't a broad church. We've heard attacks on right-wing women. We've heard attacks on women who are interested in statistics. We've heard attacks on women who would dare question the orthodoxy of feminism. I think all this proves to me that as much as I would like it to be a broad church, as much as I would like us to have those debates, most women cannot fit into the very narrow box that fourth wave feminism has brought on.
And in reality, therefore, it is of course equally possible to believe in and advocate for equal rights and opportunities for all women and men without agreeing with or supporting all, or possibly even any of the political and cultural blueprints offered by feminism.
Human beings are tribal animals. We are not meant to exist as individuals. That is catastrophic, both for our society, for our mental health, for our health generally.
Indeed, numerous surveys have shown that while the very vast majority of people in countries like the United Kingdom and America support equal rights and opportunities for all, the very vast majority of them do not identify as feminist. And while they may share some of the same ethical ideals, principles, doctrines and beliefs of some feminists, ultimately and ideologically speaking, their preferred blueprint for progressing equality and social order can be very different indeed.
When you do ask women if they're feminists, the majority say no. A study this year found that over 90% of women don't identify as feminists. A more generous study last year found that 65% of women don't identify as feminists because they understand that equality and feminism are no longer synonyms. To be honest, to be a feminist is to ooze a political ideology just as being a party member is these days, because there is a manifesto. And if you hold a different opinion on the gender pay gap or on sex strikes or on porn laws, you're not allowed in the club. You're told you're the wrong kind of woman. That's why most women don't identify.
In reality, only a very tiny proportion of these people will be especially consciously concerned or actually actively advocating on behalf of the rights and interests of men, certainly within the context and framework of addressing gendered inequalities. Those who do will have a relatively diverse range of backgrounds, of different priorities and beliefs. Not all of them will embrace the label men's rights activist, and some will even identify as feminist. As we considered in the previous episode, feminist theory currently dominates most mainstream and state-sponsored strategies and initiatives aimed at promoting equality. Consequently, when it comes to the matter of gender equality, or more specifically, addressing gendered male inequalities, some approaches are perhaps politically more popular than others. And some areas of male gender disadvantage are more readily acknowledged, even if acknowledging them would be the most ethical and equally fair thing to do. For example, consider the assertion made in the opening section by journalist and feminist Lydia Smith.
They perpetuate damaging myths, one of the most common being that women lie about sexual assault and therefore innocent men are wrongly accused of rape.
Clearly, the issue of addressing and protecting against false allegations is a very sensitive and complex matter, But clearly for people who encounter a false allegation of rape or sexual abuse, implications can be nothing short of catastrophic. Take the tragic case of Camellia Cheshire, a young woman who has recently spoken about how she was driven to the brink of suicide after losing both her mother and brother as a consequence of a false rape allegation. Her 17-year-old brother killed himself after he was knocked sideways by an allegation that he had raped someone. The allegation was eventually withdrawn, and the girl subsequently claimed someone had forced her to say such horrible things about him, but the damage had already been done. Her mother, Karen, who had bipolar disorder, suffered a nervous breakdown 5 days after his death and spent 6 months in a psychiatric unit before also taking her own life on the anniversary of her son's death. Patrick Graham's recent documentary captures the testimonies of men and families whose lives have been turned upside down by false allegations. And the code of practice for Crown prosecutors includes an entire section on false allegations of rape or domestic abuse. Consequently, the obvious question that follows such a disingenuous accusation would be, who exactly is it that's prepared to peddle dangerous myths? And why? And in reality, how credible is a definition like this?
A movement that claims to advocate men's rights but fails to do so because they're too busy complaining about and harassing feminists.
It is certainly true that MRAs often complain about feminism, but is it reasonable to suggest that feminism and feminists should be beyond criticism, or that some extremist views or false assertions are no longer open to challenge? Take another assertion from the opening section.
Not all men's rights activists are murderers, of course, but some are, and that's enough.
Lydia Smith never clarifies what she means by enough, but the inference is clearly that the reputation of all men's rights activists can in some way be tarred by the despicable and tragic actions of Elliott Rodgers. Aside from the fact that the assertion that Elliott Rodgers was a men's rights activist can be shown to be demonstrably false and based on a false equivalent, such a sweeping statement would ordinarily be condemned as ignorant and even deeply bigoted if applied to virtually any other characteristic. Not all Muslims murder children, but one wonders whether enough Muslims murder children to be enough for Lydia Smith. Not all black youths carry knives, but do enough black youths carry knives to be enough for Lydia Smith? And obviously, not all feminists fantasize about cutting up and eliminating men, but some do. So how many feminists fantasizing about cutting up and eliminating men does it take to make enough? But regardless, no man wants to be perceived by others as a woman hater or of attacking women, and that possibility, along with its very possible implications, clearly creates a considerable chill factor to be considered by anyone seeking to constructively champion the rights of boys and men.
So I guess it's just questioning. It's being willing to question things and make up your own mind.
Criticism and debate is clearly part and parcel of political discourse, and a legitimate, even crucial course of action to undertake in a functioning democracy. But any criticism or attack of a political ideology that purports to speak for all women will inevitably and very often be perceived by many to be an attack on women themselves. A misconception that some feminists are prepared to exploit, and consequently, one of the clearly legitimate reasons that men's rights activists have for criticising feminists is the simple fact that some feminists dismiss or portray them as misogynists simply for questioning some feminist beliefs. Philip Davies, one of the few MPs to have proactively championed men's issues in the UK Parliament, claims that numerous MPs from different UK parties have confided that they support much of his activism, but that they are petrified of standing up to the increasingly extreme feminist agenda, and therefore dare not say so publicly. And of course, the ever-present threat of being branded a misogynist is compounded by the very modern phenomenon of Twitter storms and online public shaming. Psychologist Helen Smith has considered the question as to why men largely cede the discussion about changing gender dynamics, and concluded that one simple reason is that they feel extremely uncomfortable speaking up on this issue, in part because they recognise the historically strong position that men have had, in part because they don't want to admit weakness, and also because they are afraid of being branded as a anti-feminist, a whiny man-baby, or worst of all, a misogynist. Perhaps inevitably then, one highly significant trend in the growing concern for male human rights advocacy is that many of the most high-profile and most effective academics, authors, activists, journalists, filmmakers, educators, parents and young people championing the issue of men's rights just so happen to be women. Obviously, it's harder to dismiss them as misogynists or male supremacists or wanting to see a return to the 1950s.
Yeah. It's always the 1950s, isn't it? It's never 1949 or never 1914.
Harder, but not impossible. And sadly, women who step forwards face a whole other layer of challenges, and sometimes extremely unsisterly smears. One especially underhand tactic applied to female MRAs is to accuse them of being pick-me's, or even less elegantly, pick-me-ass bitches. For the uninitiated, a pick-me or a pick-me-ass bitch is a woman who craves the attention, acceptance and approval of men so much that they are prepared to degrade, humiliate or shame other women in order to uplift themselves so that they get picked. A woman who wants the attention of the opposite sex so badly, she's prepared to throw her fellow women under the bus. The insinuation is as realistic as attempts to portray male activists as pick-up artists. And in reality, of course, women enter activism for much more obvious reasons. Many are motivated out of love and concern for their sons and their daughters, and even their grandchildren. Many will have lost male family members or friends, or watched helplessly as they have been let down by public services. Some just feel intuitively that it is the right thing to do, and inevitably, many are motivated by their personal experience of feminism. But sadly, if sycophancy, slut-shaming, or sexism smears don't stick, there are still plenty of other isms that can be applied.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.